So a real pleasure for me now to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jonathan Lewin. Dr. Lewin is the Executive VP for Health Affairs at Emory University, Executive Director of the Woodruff Health Sciences Center, CEO and Chairman of the Board, Emory Healthcare. Stated succinctly, Dr. Lewin is a national leader in academic medicine strategy and integrated healthcare delivery, and an international scientific leader in magnetic resonance imaging. His pioneering work in interventional and intraoperative MRI imaging culminated in over 200 publications, 70 book chapters, 36 patents, and has impacted the practice of medicine. John received his undergraduate degree from Brown University, MD from Yale, and diagnostic radiology training at university hospitals. Now, during his radiology training, we had a very candid conversation about this. He recalls working really hard. And remember, this was a period when duty hour rules were not enforced. The work was so tough that at one point, he acknowledges that he teamed up with a like-minded neurosurgical resident, our own Warren Selman, who's in the audience. And the two of them considered alternative career paths. Given you heard from Dr. DeGiorgia, our rich history in music and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they considered a career in rock music. If you're trying to figure out who is Dr. Lewin and who is Dr. Selman, there they are, and you can see they haven't changed a bit over the many years. Now, you'll note on the right-hand side of the slide that their band underwent a number of names. I list two, the Specimens Lethal Dose 50, but there were many, many others. And I queried Dr. Selman again this morning as to the basis why their names kept changing. And he's a neurosurgeon, so it's hard to crack these guys. But he sheepishly acknowledged after the 10th time that they were so bad that the only way they could get opportunities to play at gigs was to change their name frequently. These experiences were helpful, however. They were instructive to Dr. Lewin, who decided to reinvest vigorously in radiology and pursue additional training. An MRI research fellowship in Germany, neuroradiology fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic, and head and neck radiology in Pittsburgh. He began his faculty career at UH, where he would rise to serve as the director of the Division of MRI and professor and vice chairman for research and academic affairs in the Department of Radiology. He moved to Johns Hopkins in 2004 as chairman of radiology and radiologic science at the university and radiologist in chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I note for the audience's benefit that this was the position formerly held by Elias Zerhouni, who had recently moved to assume the directorship of the National Institutes of Health. So Dr. Lewin had some big shoes to fill, and by all accounts, he did that quite ably, and the department flourished. After 12 years at Hopkins, he moved to Emory in his current role. A consummate contributor to the biomedical community and ecosystem, Dr. Lewin has served in numerous roles within major scientific and medical societies, including serving as president of 5 radiology organizations. For these efforts and many others that I won't enumerate for the sake of time, he has been recognized with a number of honors and awards, of which I highlight just a few. Gold Medal Awards for Distinguished Service from the American Rank and Race Society and the Association of University Radiologists. In 2017, he was named by Modern Healthcare as one of the 50 most influential physicians in the nation. And in 2019, he was elected to the prestigious National Academy of Inventors. So with those few words, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Jonathan Lewin.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jane, for that too kind introduction. I always feel like I'm, hearing a eulogy. Make sure my pulse is going. No, I'm still okay. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. McGarrian, also for inviting me. It's a real honor to be the inaugural speaker for this really wonderful, wonderful new tradition that you've now started. And as was said, UH has such a big part in my life and my career that I'm just delighted to be here. I'd like to start off really, if you'll permit me, with an autobiographical moment. And some of it will overlap a little bit with the introduction, but I think it's worth sort of understanding the career because it's been a career of twists and turns. And I think that certainly my middle school teachers would not have ever predicted that I would be in my current role. And neither would most of people, neither would have I until very recently. So starting with an autobiographical moment, I started my real love with technology, and it's technology and innovations which really driven me. I started it actually just a couple blocks from here in Crawford Hall at Case Western Reserve University, where in 1972, Professor Frank Bradshaw, a new assistant professor of computer science at Case, decided for a reason that I have no idea to bring some middle school East Side kids down to teach them computer science one summer. So I'd ride my bicycle down on Sunday, actually it went through the school year as well, ride my bicycle down the hill from the East Side, learn theory from Dr. Bradshaw, and then he got us accounts on the Case PDP-10, the big, it was actually on the ARPANET it was called, early internet. It wasn't actually just invented more recently, but in fact it was around. And so learned how to computer program at a very young age. And in fact, my first paid job beyond a paper boy was working at a spin-off of Case Western Reserve called Chi Corporation, which was also down the street, which was a computer processing company. And in fact, I got paid to write machine code for the operating system on a UNIVAC 1108. And just to remind you, that it was nowhere near as powerful as your cell phone, but it filled rooms down the street. And in fact, you might guess this actually is not me right here, just to make sure you understand. Unfortunately, this was me around the same time. So you can tell my style, my fashion styles have not changed much, although my hairstyle has just a bit. Well, I went off to Brown University, as was mentioned, and I actually started off as a physical chemist. I wanted to be a physicist when I went, met a chemistry professor who convinced me physical chemistry was a better way to go. And my junior year, I was all set for a chemistry lab career, worked in a lab, Jerry Diebold's physical chemistry lab, which was really great. Dr. Diebold needed a CO2 laser for his experiments. So he said, okay, go build a CO2 laser. So I got to look up how you build a laser, machine the parts down in the machine shop and the chemistry thing, built it, ended up with a 14-watt continuous infrared laser, which would literally burn through a block of wood. Nothing could be better. But I did realize as I thought about my career that actually a lab career probably wasn't for me, that actually medicine, and my father was a doctor and I kind of denied I would ever be interested, medicine might actually be of interest. So I had not taken a single biology course as of the end of my junior year. I actually signed up for an intro biology at Cleveland State University, did it the summer before my senior year of college so I could apply to medical school. And so I applied. I decided to go to Yale School of Medicine. And there, I originally went in thinking I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon. And, again, was very interesting. I was interested in biomechanics, and I thought it'd be a way to combine my interest in technology and power tools with medicine, lots of good things. But then I discovered radiology and really fell in love with the imaging technologies. At Yale, you had to do a thesis to graduate. I did my thesis in pediatric nuclear medicine. And there I met one of my sort of really first big role model, and that was Dr. Paul Hoffer. He was the director of nuclear medicine, a giant in the field of nuclear medicine, and the quintessential gentleman scholar. Unbelievably kind, unbelievably generous with his time for a medical student. Helped me with my first publication in a great journal as a medical student. And it was very, really gave me the first sort of bit of that academic excitement of an academic career. Well, as I decided, I thought I would go into pediatric radiology. The other co-author, Nancy Rosenfield, was one of our very dynamic pediatric radiologists at the time at Yale. And so I decided to do a pediatric internship, stayed at Yale New Haven Hospital for that internship, and then decided to come to University Hospitals of Cleveland for my residency. And I got asked earlier today, why UH? And it was really because the residents at the time were not only smart, not only capable, but actually were doing so much. We were making decisions, we were doing procedures. It was just an unbelievable time, and it was just a great place to go. So I came here, I got great training, and the research and technology bug was pretty deep at that point. So I started doing research with my background in physics, physical chemistry, as well as my interest in imaging. I ended up doing research in MRI physics. And it turns out back in those days, really only neuroradiology was using MRI. There were a few other areas, but really neuro was where everything was at. So I decided I would go into pediatric neuroradiology. So as a resident, I started doing research in MR angiography, which is something that was really developed here. And as was mentioned, the first superconducting MR system was in this hospital. When I left New Haven, there was only one MRI in the city. It was at a private practice neurology practice. When I got here, there were two in the basement of the MRI building at that time. So again, started doing MR research and did neonatal, the first pediatric MR angiography actually published. I also had another mentor here, and that was Dr. John Haga. Dr. Haga, who I know just recently retired, was just a tremendous role model of unending intellectual curiosity. He used to say people either had the curse or they didn't. And to him, what the curse was insatiable curiosity. So if you had the curse, you could discover great things. If you didn't have the curse, no matter how hard you tried to get someone interested in research, it would never take hold. This is where I learned a very important lesson. If you're going to give heparin injections to pigs, don't do it in the pig pen without shoe covers. So unfortunately, we both had to throw out our shoes, I think. Well, I ended up, as you heard, going on for a research fellowship. It was supposed to be in lieu of my last year of residency. We had a program, which I think still exists, going to work at the Siemens MR R&D Center in Erlangen at the time, West Germany. And it was a fantastic opportunity. I was one of 3 physicians in a facility with about 200 physicists and engineers doing research in medical imaging and MRI. Incredible time to be in Germany because it was 1989, 1990. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989. So this was the West Berlin side of the wall. And I was able to do my own part in taking down the wall. Amazingly, just months earlier, East German border guards were shooting people trying to get over the wall to escape. And now the wall was down. Well, while I was there, it turned out that the residency, the RRC, changed their rules. So they no longer would credit a full year of residency, of research for residency. So I had to come back to UH and finish up 6 more months. Oh, I should mention, so while I was there, I worked on MR angiography, developing techniques for intracranial MR angiography that are still being used. And actually, these are the first images of 3D body MR angiography, which again is now, with the addition of contrast, the technique of choice still many years later. I ended up coming back to UH, finishing up my residency. I spent 6 months on faculty as assistant professor doing musculoskeletal radiology because there was a shortage at the time, and then went on to the Cleveland Clinic for a neuroradiology fellowship. And again, I continued my interest in research, developing some techniques. This is a technique that no one has ever seen since this publication, so unlike the other couple. But at any rate, enjoyed my neuroradiology training. I stayed on at the clinic for a short time. And it turned out at the time, the Cleveland Clinic had a strong ENT department, but no head and neck imaging, no head and neck radiologists. So they decided to send me off for some training, sent me to Pittsburgh Eye and Ear Hospital, where I did a 3-month mini sabbatical there, working with this gentleman, Dr. Hugh Curtin. And he is, again, one of my true heroes and role models. He is the quintessential gentleman teacher, the most incredible teacher I've ever worked with. And I really styled my teaching style as much after him as I could possibly do. Had a little time in 3 months to do some more research. This is the fast spin echo, fat suppressed imaging is actually still the way we do head and neck imaging. So I'm very proud that paper did last in terms of its impact. Well, I didn't last at the clinic long. I decided at the time, really wanted to get back to real academics, which I felt was UH. Chuck Lanzieri, who was the head of neuroradiology, and John Haga recruited me back to be the director of MRI. So I came back to UH, sort of take two, to university hospitals. And it turned out it was perfect timing. The whole MR research group, under the direction of Dr. Mark Hakey, who was an MR physicist, had just up and left. He had gotten recruited to St. Louis to Wash U. He took the whole group with him. So I ended up coming in as the director, clinical. We had a great clinical program, great technologists, but the research building was empty. And that was probably the best opportunity I ever could have had. John Haga gave me a little bit of money, not as much as I should have asked for, to hire a software engineer, a programmer. I hired a guy by the name of Dave Miller right out of undergrad programming. Hired a second guy, Dee Wu, who had a master's degree. He was really sort of a higher level programmer and started doing research. It turns out there was a great functional imaging group here. Functional imaging had just been described, functional MR imaging. I had had a chance working with Dr. Gene Tcash, a physicist over at the clinic, to do the first functional MR over there. Turns out there was a group here that was doing great work. I was able to sort of slip right in and work with them, and again, did some really interesting work with that group. One of the best things that Dr. Mark Hakey ever did for me was, as he was leaving, he said, you know what? There's a young physicist down the street at one of our local hospitals you really ought to meet. And that was Dr. Jeff Dirk. So I met Dr. Dirk, who was a fantastic guy, worked with John Haga to recruit him, and brought him over as the first really PhD scientist in the sort of rebuilt MR research group. Well, we moved on from functional imaging. At the time, Dr. Warren Selman was a pioneer in stroke treatment. We were doing thrombolysis when people didn't even know how to spell it. When I first got back actually even before that. So the earliest days of interventional neuroradiology with Dr. Selman's really push was just fantastic. And diffusion-weighted imaging just had made it onto commercial systems. It had been around in research systems, but finally made it where a commercial, regular clinical MR could do it. So we actually, on the top, we actually did the first study that got the first 510K approval for clinically usable diffusion-weighted imaging. On the bottom are images that Dee Wu, who was at this point had become a PhD student with us, helped generate first perfusion images that were actually performed right on the scanner, so you could see them. So we started doing hyper-fast diffusion-perfusion imaging to be able to see at-risk tissue that could be salvaged, again, using the techniques that Dr. Selman and Dr. Rob Tarr were really pioneering. And you can see our own Dr. Sunshine was the first author on this paper, as he took this program and ran with it. Well, really what was most sort of differentiating about our research program was the work that we did in interventional MRI. And interventional MRI, as we defined it, was the use of MR imaging for interactive guidance of diagnostic and therapeutic procedures. And I stress interactive. It's not just using it to plan surgery or to check to see how surgery was done afterwards. It's the interactive part. And in 1994, when I first started pushing to build an interventional MR field, if you asked anyone what animal would come to mind if you thought of the speed of an MRI, chances are they'd say a tortoise, right? Because at that point, it took about 5 to 7 minutes to do a single T1 weighted sequence of a knee. It was slow. So really our first step was to see whether with minor modifications we could really speed up the process. And in fact, we sort of had to start from scratch. We had to figure out how do you look at needles, how do you image them. This was a technique the FDA actually started asking for data from our paper from vendors, from manufacturers, before they would approve needles. And we developed a system. We developed MR-compatible monitors and computer mouse and optical tracking, working really closely with Siemens. And then, again, we started doing cases. We installed our first open scanner in February of '95. And by July, we were doing clinical cases. We had developed enough of the technologies. This was a 14-year-old who came in with an ugly-looking discitis, osteomyelitis, pushing on the spinal cord. A patient came into the emergency room in the middle of the night. Dr. Al Cohn, who was our pediatric neurosurgeon at the time, saw the patient, called me at home and said, do you think you can get a sample for culture? And while it's a little hard for you to see, over here, this dark line, I'll make it a little easier for you. Right there is where it was. There's a needle coming through, and again, hard to see on this image because this was the earliest, very beginning. There's the carotid and the vertebral arteries, the two red areas. So again, we were able to see them, safely get a sample, put the patient on the right antibiotics. He walked out of the hospital. This is a similar patient, similar looking, ugly C1, C2 infection. Actually decided to go to a world famous hospital down the street from here and went in. They did a surgical biopsy of the prevertebral area of the C1, C2, got mouth flora because they had to go through the mouth. Couldn't figure it out. Guy was going into septic shock about 2 weeks into his case there. So he got transferred here, and here's a needle going in. A little easier to see. Oops, sorry about that. A little bit easier to see the carotid artery in front and the vertebral artery. We'd made a lot of progress in the imaging in that time. And we got the diagnosis, a 14-gauge cutting needle, cut a sample on gram stain. They saw the organism and actually treated him successfully. The real reason I started on interventional MRI was not to do biopsies, as impactful as those could be, but it was to treat cancer. And I had seen a paper. There was a guy by the name of Frank Yoles at Brigham and Women's Hospital, wrote a paper in around 1992 and had a symposium talking about MRI, interventional MRI, and he showed he had a paper on laser tissue interactions under MR, and he showed that you could actually visualize tissue necrosis on MR in the immediate necrotic phase with a laser. So I thought this sounds like you could really do some good things. They started treating, actually someone in Leipzig, Germany, or Düsseldorf, Germany, did the first treatments of brain tumors using this, and I thought this was great. Well, it turns out Warren and his colleagues didn't really like the idea of a radiologist making burr holes. So I figured, okay, I'll go somewhere where no one will complain. Figured I'd go to the abdomen. So as a neuroradiologist, I started with RF ablation instead of laser in the abdomen, and what you're seeing here is a kidney tumor. This is the lower pole of the right kidney, and a big tumor sticking off the front there. And this is an RF electrode coming into the tumor. And once it was nicely centered in the tumor, we'd go ahead and ablate it. And we modified the RF ablation system, made an MR-compatible electrodes. Here's Bobby, who was one of our wonderful MR techs, who was helping a patient in the scanner. And again, you could see what starts off as a bright, gray, light gray tumor. When it's ablated, turns black. Very easy to see when you've missed a piece, and in fact, you go in and touch up the edges. These were the first, we and Mass General, hard to say within a couple of weeks of each other, did the first kidney RF ablations, and hard to say who did them first, but they were pretty close. And the real bottom line is it was a team effort. This was the interventional MR program team, lots of folks in radiology who worked on this, in biomedical engineering, cardiology, oncology, the neurosurgery group, otolaryngology, urology, vascular surgery. This was interdisciplinary research. You couldn't do it without all those folks. And here's the group we were at one of our MR meetings and here's much of the group around a table. Well, this led to the idea of moving from just putting needles, using needles, to actually intraoperative MR imaging. And it turns out that Peter Black and Frank Yoles at Brigham and Women's had started doing surgeries in the MR. And we worked on ensuring that our MR suite down in the basement of Bowell, we did bacterial surveillance, we looked at the ventilation system and increased the air exchanges, and we made it safe for patients for transsphenoidal surgery. So our own Dr. Selman did the first MR-guided transsphenoidal surgeries in the Western Hemisphere back in 1997 down in the MR suite. Well, while he did great work and we were able to see residual tumor so we could go in and get it out so there was nothing left, while it worked great in the basement, I don't think anyone was really happy doing neurosurgery in the basement. So we ultimately went and put a suite up on the second floor. We developed a special operating table so the actual operation could be outside the magnet and we could easily swing the patient in to see what was going on, with the idea that from the surface of the brain, it can be hard to tell what's happening deep, whereas on MR images, again, one can see, and a number of collaborators here, Dr. Andy Metzger, Robert Masunas, obviously Dr. Selman was our senior author on this, along with a number of others. Well, one of the other sort of sidelines was molecular imaging, sort of the precursor to the CCIR that we have right now. And this was actually Al Cohn again, was trying to do this study on hydrocephalus, neonatal hydrocephalus, in a mouse model. And every time he cut open the head of one of these mice, the brain would just collapse, it would leak out, it would collapse. He couldn't tell what exactly. He had like little membranes. What did it look like? So he asked if we could image it on a regular body 1.5 Tesla scanner in 1998 technology. We were able to build high-resolution microscopic coils to be able to image neonatal mouse brains, transgenic prostate cancer models, again around the same time, and a little bit later, even pituitaries in a mouse on a 1.5 Tesla scanner. So that was another thing that then grew into a grant proposal, which was funded and started the first high-field mouse or small animal imager, now with a wonderful program here. Well, I had been vice chair of the department, as you heard here, for about 7 years, and I had folks asking if I was interested in being a chair in different places, and I looked at a couple places, and none of them really could support the kind of research that we had going on here. And then in April of 2003, I got a letter from Johns Hopkins saying I'd been nominated for the chair there. And my first reaction, I went to talk to John Haga, and I said, I got this letter from Hopkins, and I knew of about 3 sitting radiology chairs who were looking to follow Elias Zerhouni in that role. And I said to John, they're not going to take a 43-year-old from Cleveland to be chair. I'm not even going to bother sending in my CV. And John, John said something that really was just tremendously meaningful. He said, you never want to look back and regret the fact you didn't even try. Send in your CV and see what happens. Well, 3 rounds of interviews later, in fact, they did hire me to be the chair of Johns Hopkins Department of Radiology and the chief of the Johns Hopkins Hospital Radiologist in Chief. And unlike most places at Hopkins, there were 7 of the clinical chairs were also what were called functional unit directors. So there were a few areas where the chairs were in charge of the hospital as well, the technical side, as well as just the faculty and the professional side. And radiology was one of them. So we had a major, big radiology program. The faculty side was big. It's about 120 people on faculty when I got there, about 245 when I left. So we expanded a lot. But the technical side was pretty complicated in terms of operations of a major business. We had around $225 million of revenue, and when I actually of expense, We never saw our revenue because it went straight to the hospital. But we had about a $225 million expense budget. So it was managing a pretty big business. And a lot of the skills I learned that have come in handy more recently came from the time that I spent there, learning how to do a business plan, learning how to develop a business, learning how to run operations, learning how to cut costs by using lean techniques and process improvement. And I learned a tremendous amount. My dean at the time, dean CEO, Ed Miller, who had hired me, saw that things were going pretty well in the Department of Radiology and started asking me to take on sort of problem childs within the system to help fix things that were broken. He also gave me a great opportunity when healthcare transformation, value-based care started to just become a word before the Accountable Care Act. He asked me to join a small think tank with the head of our insurance business at Hopkins, with the head of our faculty practice plan, with a couple of key administrators, 3 physicians, to start charting out how should Johns Hopkins look at changing its model to be able to thrive in a value-based care environment. I thought this was really fun. I thought it was great. It was innovative. It was creative. I sort of took it, and there was a course up at Harvard Business School, one of their executive education courses on healthcare transformation. It was a 9-month course with 3 weeks on campus or 6 weeks on campus, and then the rest in between on your own. So I went and did that, really caught the bug on it. When Dr. Miller retired, the new dean was coming in and got to know him a little bit, and he asked me if I would be the co-chair of strategic planning for the whole organization. So I had the chance to write turned out the first strategic plan since 1996 was written. It was about 2012 at that point. So they hadn't had one for quite a while. So we wrote the plan and started working on executing it. And it turns out the part on integration, healthcare integration in the global plan, which included research and everything, wasn't going that well. So he and the health system president asked if I'd take on the role as senior vice president for integrated healthcare delivery. So I went into that role and started working on integrating the private practice groups and all of the hospitals that we were adding, trying to work on service lines. We talked a little bit about that earlier with the Anton Fellows. Again, really enjoyed what I was doing and was working more and more closely with the dean's office and the C-suite, and less having time for the department. So I was at a point where I had asked the dean to do a search for the next chair of radiology, as I thought I would move more permanently into the administrative side, when I got a call from the former dean at Hopkins, a guy by the name of Mike Johns. I had met Mike sort of a little bit of a, he was introduced by a mutual friend, and he was a little bit of a mentor. I'd sit and talk to him about career things. And he had been the executive vice president for health affairs at Emory. And he said, hey, there's a transition. He had been gone for about 10 years from the role, but the last one was stepping down. Are you interested? I said, no, I kind of like what I'm doing here, not the right time. And he called me about 3 months later, and he said, the search is going on. Are you interested? I'm like, well, not the right time. So then he called me, actually the head of the search committee called me about 2 months later and said, hey, we're at the finalist round. We really want you to come down and talk to us. So I did, and sort of the rest is history. My wife Linda will tell you we just closed on a condominium overlooking the harbor in Baltimore with the most beautiful view you've ever seen. And I told her, don't buy new furniture yet. And in fact, we ended up having to sell it and moving to Atlanta. And so at Emory University, it's a really interesting model. As the executive vice president for health affairs, the deans of the schools of medicine, public health, nursing report up to me. The head of the cancer center, we have a big primate research center there, as well as the health system report up to the EVP for health affairs. The EVP is the chair of the board. Up until I arrived, they had a separate CEO of the health system, but things were kind of a little tenuous. The health system was going in one direction. The academics were going in another. There were some tensions between the two. President Wagner, who also was the provost here at Case Western Reserve before he went to be president there, asked if I would take on both roles. So, it was a great idea from an alignment perspective. It was a terrible idea from a work-life balance perspective, but I did take on both roles and had a lot of fun kind of working on things and fixing a lot of the misalignments and really concentrating sort of on three things: on creating strategic clarity, on creating an effective architecture for the organization, and for working on a constructive culture. And working in each of those three buckets really for the last 6 years with a lot of success. We've grown from about a $3 billion revenue health system to about $5.5 billion. Our research portfolio has gone from about $500 million up to about $850 million. And again, our schools have done remarkably well in terms of their rankings. So it's been a great ride for the last 5.5 years since I've been there. So again, let's think, what have I learned? Again, I must have learned something through all this. Let me share a little bit. And I love Dr. Tomei's talk. I agree with all the things that she said here. And actually, you'll hear a couple of similar topics. And one of the things I love is Peter Drucker once said, management is doing things right. And, we all have to be managers at some point in our careers, right? Managing a big radiology department, managing a MR research group, managing the clinical MRI side, managing a hospital. But what's key is that while management is doing things right, leadership is doing the right things. And there are two very different things between leadership and management. They overlap, but they're very different. And I'd like to share a couple of postulates that I've developed for myself moving forward. And the first of them is that too much managing can undermine your leadership effectiveness. Again, someone who comes from being an effective manager, when things are broken, they say, I can fix it, and they want to jump in there. Well, as a leader, that's not your job. You want to instead set a clear direction, communicate it clearly, empower your team, and let them fly. And so that's really an important part of effective leadership as opposed to management. In fact, Booker T. Washington once said, few things can help an individual more than to place responsibility on him and to let him know that you trust him. So trusting your team and letting them go is what's really key. The second part of that is, do people serve their leaders? When I would get new chief residents every year, I would sit down at the table with them and sort of say, well, you're chief resident, what's your job? And I would say that of the 12 years I was at Hopkins, probably 9 out of the 12 years, one of the chiefs would say, well, our job is to, tell the residents what to do so that they're successful. And I would postulate, they said, we're the boss of the residents. And I would say, well, actually, and I'd put it on a piece of paper and turn it upside down and say, no, actually, your job, if you're doing your job right, you're letting your people have the skills, the resources, the opportunity to do their jobs. So as CEO, if I'm doing my job, my leadership team has everything they need to do their jobs. If they do their jobs, their teams have everything they need, all the way up to the top of this inverted pyramid, which is the nurses, the techs, the students, the doctors, the people who are actually the researchers, people who are actually touching the patients, creating the value on the front lines. And that's really an important, that leads to my second postulate, which is that effective leadership is a set of behaviors and beliefs that place the good of the organization above self-interest. Again, it's not that you're telling people what to do, it's you're helping people to do the right things. Harry Truman once said, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit, which is so true. The third postulate's a really important one. Some people need a lot of outside validation, right? They love it when people say thank you and show gratitude. And if you need a regular proof of gratitude and appreciation, get a dog, because you're not going to get it from the people you're leading. And it's not a bad thing. It's not that they don't appreciate you. They're not going to say it because if you do a great job, they think you're not doing anything, right? Because you're doing a great job. You're giving the credit to others. You're letting them work. And they're not going to thank you. But again, you're making a real difference. There's a corollary that's really incredible, and you'll have to raise your hands. We'll see if you've seen this, but that's that no good deed goes unpunished. And I don't know how many of you have seen this in your own worlds here, yeah? So it turns out the people you do the most for, the people you push the hardest to help, are the least likely to say thank you. And I don't know why it is, but that's clearly been my experience over the years. Really, the next postulate comes from one of my favorite quotes, which is Winston Churchill, who said, "A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, while an optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." And in fact, that leads to this postulate, which is from Warren Bennis, that leaders lead by leading, and they learn best by leading in the face of obstacles. As weather shapes mountains, problems shape leaders. And in fact, if you look at any problem you have as an opportunity for you to make a difference, for you to learn, for you to grow as a leader, then it makes leading a lot of fun. If you see them all as problems and difficulties, it can be a tough journey to try to be a leader. And then my last postulate is something I learned from a guy by the name of Brian Granulotti, who was my partner in integrated healthcare delivery at Hopkins before he went on to be the CEO at the Atlantic Health System in New Jersey. And really, he was the first person who articulated something that really resonated with me. And that's before any major decision will never go wrong if we always first ask, is it best for our patients and their families? Because there's a sacred trust we have as caregivers. Secondly, you have to ask, is it good for our people, including the trainees? Because if the answer is no, that's when that idea stops. And only after the first two of those are yes, do we say, is it profitable? Is it right for the bottom line? Or is it a strategic investment that we want to do for strategy's sake? But if the first two questions, if the answer is no, then you look for a different way to get to the same results. So having shared this postulate, I want to, in our last sort of 15 minutes or so, talk about really what I've distilled down from my perspective as what are those ingredients to give your leadership career not only success, but also to make it fulfilling for you. So again, my recipe, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be your recipe, but hopefully it will resonate. And as Dr. Tomei said, first on my list is to know yourself. Really, that's the most critical part of being an effective leader. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, know what your personal values are. When I was, while I was still here at University Hospitals, I read a book by Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. How many of you have ever heard of it? Yeah, it was really a great book when it first came out, and in it, he talks about writing down your personal values. And I have to say, as a junior assistant professor, I'd never thought about my personal values. But it forced me to sit down, reflect, and write about it, and write them down. And I suggest if you haven't done it, think about what are your personal values. And there are a couple reasons. One is, as you make important decisions, and again, right now I have 36,000 people who potentially I could really screw things up for. So before making a decision, make sure that it reflects your personal values, that it's not going against those. Because if it's not consistent with your personal values, there may be a problem with that decision. Secondly, as you're looking at your career, where you're working, make sure your personal values align with those of the organization. Because if for you to be happy, you can't be second guessing the organization's direction. You want to make sure that your personal values align with the organization as well. So you can't do that if you don't know them. Secondly, as we heard earlier, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, and I always add, know your preferences, know what it is you like, because you may not like everything you're good at. You might like some of the things you're not so good at, but know what your preference is, because you really want to work in an area where most of what you do, now it'll never be everything, but most of what you do is what you enjoy, because then you'll excel. Then you'll have energy, then you'll do great things. And if you try to work in something that you just don't like, even if perhaps you're pretty good at it, over the long haul, it's not a great idea. The third thing, again, we heard a little bit in the earlier talk by Dr. Somé, is understanding your hot buttons. We all have them. What are those things that evoke an emotional response from us as we're dealing with conflict, as we're dealing with situations? For me, it's honesty. If I think someone's being dishonest, I can feel my blood pressure going up and my neck turns a little red, and it drives me crazy when someone does that. Knowing that it's coming, if you know what your hot buttons are, you can say it, a little voice in your head can say, okay, I know it's coming, I'm gonna stay calm, I'm not gonna get emotional, I'm not gonna let that impact my decision making. Because clearly when your amygdala is making the decision, it's not as good as your frontal lobes. So you wanna know your hot buttons, know where things are coming from, and immunize yourself from reacting to it. And you can do that. It works pretty well. And lastly, back to my corollary, if you're someone who does need a lot of thank yous, then don't count on it from work, but go work with your church, synagogue, mosque, work with community groups, do something where people really appreciate it and thank you in the volunteer world or in your spiritual world. Do something that you'll get that feedback from, so you don't lose that anchor in your life. Well, the second ingredient is relationships. When Ed Miller, I was nominated for a deanship when I was at Hopkins. I went to talk to Ed Miller and said to Ed, what do you think is the most important part of your job, the success of your job? And he said to me, it's the relationships. And I have to say he was absolutely right. The bigger your leadership job, the more important all of those relationships are. And those could be with your peers, the fellow chairs, if you're a chairman or chairperson, your direct reports, it's critical, your boss, customers, i.e. patients, or for radiologists, we have customers who are the other clinicians who are coming to ask questions. Vendors, those relationships can be incredibly important. Many others, invest in those relationships, because those work relationships pay off in multiples, especially when you get to difficult times. The next ingredient is highly related. If you build the relationships, you can work on establishing trust. And trust is really built on honesty. Lincoln once said, honesty is not the best policy, it's the only policy. So be very careful what you promise as a leader, because you can't afford to break a promise. You're better off saying, I wish I could do that for you, but I can't. Because breaking a promise is the quickest way to break trust. Make sure you don't show favorites. Always be fair. When I went to Hopkins, the head of neuroradiology, who was the person, it turns out, who nominated me for the position, was somebody I'd been on the speaking circuit with for years. I knew him really well. We weren't friends at that point, but we became friends. I bent over backwards to make sure that I didn't give the neuroradiology division any more than I gave every other division in the department. Because I didn't want people to think, oh, he's friends with Dave Usum and he's giving him more resources, more latitude, whatever. So fairness is really important. Honesty is not just a matter of big things. But Albert Einstein once said, whoever is careless with the truth in small matters can't be trusted with important matters. And to me, this is absolutely true. If I find someone who's skirting on the truth, they're not someone who's going to end up on my leadership team in the long term. Very important. Another ingredient is, you can say all these things, but you need to walk the talk. You need to live your values. People do what you do, not what you say. So if they see that what you're saying and what you're doing aren't resonant, aren't aligned, they aren't going to believe you, pretty much. They're not going to follow you. So make sure whatever your values are, whatever you say, is really what you believe and what you do. You need to continually show respect, humility, make sure that you treat everyone well, with courtesy. All those things are very important, and people watch. And depending what the leader does is what they feel is fine for them in the organization. Again, John Gardner was the Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now it's HHS, but This was during Lyndon Johnson's time, and he was actually the architect of the Great Society. He was the guy who started Medicare and Social Security. He's the one who really designed them. And he once said, the society that scorns excellence in plumbing because plumbing is a humble activity and tolerates shoddiness in philosophy because philosophy is an exalted activity will have neither good plumbing nor good philosophy. Neither its pipes nor its theories will hold water. And I think it's really important to recognize everyone's got a job. And it's important to respect the environmental services person who's mopping the OR as much as you respect the surgeon, because they're each doing their job for the benefit of the patient. And they all each deserve your same levels of respect for their humanity. So it's really important. It's something that people will watch and people will again, follow. The next ingredient is engagement. You want to engage and empower your people. And that's really important. You want to foster collaboration and trust by showing that you trust them and what they're doing. You want to empower the people on your team in order to excel. You want to give them the training. You want to give them the resources. You want to give them the opportunities to succeed. And if they fall, you want to stand them back up, help them with what they did wrong, and let them go again until they feel confident. In essence, you want to turn your team into leaders. And if you lose somebody because they go off to be a leader in some other department, some other institution, and you've helped form them into that leader, you should be proud, not sad, that you're losing them. And actually, I love it. Maya Angelou, Dr. Marion, we're on the same page there. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So if you make your team members feel valued, feel entrusted, feel empowered, they'll never forget that, and they'll perform for you. One of the most important things as a leader is to be able to help create a shared vision and illuminate where we're going, illuminate the path forward. It's important that a leader spread optimism, spread hope, and create clarity. I like to think of a leader as an ambiguity sponge. They soak up all the ambiguity, so when you look ahead, all you see is the clear path that the organization wants to go on. And if you can do that as a leader, your teams are going to want to follow you. Of course, one of the harder parts, once you've developed the shared vision, is to be able to make sure everyone understands why and the what and the how. And that comes down to communication. And again, George Bernard Shaw once said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. And so often we believe we have said things, we could not say things more clearly, yet nobody has heard them. So communicate, communicate, communicate. Do it in many different channels, whether it's email and town halls and text and Twitter and whatever floats your hand, going in front lines to the, walking, managing by walking around. Communicate clearly. When it goes wrong, it can be a problem. I'd like to share an example of what happens if communication breaks down.
Das hier ist mein Sektor.
Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät.
Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
So again, things don't always go well in communication, and you have to keep that in mind. So the next ingredient is compassion. You really want to show and sow compassion amongst your team, amongst your organization, amongst your department. You want to encourage people. It's so important, especially from a leader. And it can be simple. For example, when I was at Hopkins as chair, I would say that in my first 2 years, my wastebasket in my office was emptied twice by someone other than me. It was, our environmental services just never did anything. Then one day, I came in and my wastebasket was emptied, and my desk was dusted, and it was just unbelievable. And Valerie was our new environmental services person in our suite. And she came every day, every morning I'd come in, things could not be better. So I did something that took me about maybe a minute and a half. I emailed her boss, and I just said, hey, I just want to let you know, Valerie's been cleaning my suite for the last 2 weeks, and she is absolutely fantastic. I cannot imagine a more dedicated employee. That's all I said. It took me about that long to write it. Sent it to the boss, and she came in walking on air, and she was beaming for months. And how long and how hard was that? So how often do we say thank you? How often do we acknowledge things? And it can be pretty simple with big response. Acknowledging contributions. If you're in a meeting and a project's been done, you can say, well, I really want to thank Susan for doing the groundwork on this and doing such a great job of it. It doesn't take a lot of effort and can make someone's day. And having a culture of celebration. When I was at Hopkins, I had a head administrator for our technical work who just was unbelievable at creating these fun celebrations with party hats and favors and all sorts of stuff whenever something great would happen. We'd get reaccredited and people just loved it. It was really silly stuff, and people looked forward to that every time. Again, it comes down to compassion. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion in how you work with them. And in fact, if you want to be happy, practice compassion, because it's good for the soul. And a really important thing that I learned here at UH in the MR research group was taking the time to be a mentor. It's so important, and it comes back to you in so many great ways. Again, we can't hold a torch to light another's path without brightening our own. And it is so true. The research success we had was really our trainees and how they worked. Making a difference. Again, discovery consists of what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody has thought. And one of the keys to my research career was this quote: if at first the idea is not absurd, then there is no hope for it. And then from a leadership perspective, it's clear that the status quo is just not an option. So if you're going to do something, if you're going to be a leader, you got to make a difference. You have to create something of value. And then the last of these ingredients is persistence and optimism, which gets back to Winston Churchill. A pessimist sees the difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist, the opportunity in every difficulty. So on my career, as I reflected back, the unifying themes are really high risk. I liked risk in the research. I liked taking risk in the jobs that I took. And these were the ingredients. And I'll leave with just a couple of thoughts. The first is the importance of things outside of work. And again, you may be working 60 or 80 or 90 hours a week, but the idea of what you bring home and what you bring to work are critical. I don't think of it as work-life balance. Think of it as work-life synergy. So if you're doing things right, you're bringing home excitement to your kids, to your family, and hopefully you bring the love from them with you. And I'm delighted that the love of my life, Linda, is here with me today, which many of you know because of her distinguished career in medicine and medical education. So that's really critical. So to summarize, I've given you a lot of theory, and in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So hopefully these worked for me, but hopefully some of these ideas will work for you. The other issue is that times do change, and I started in the 1990s, and again, the times now are a little bit different in many different ways. So the one thing you have to remember is the humility that it ain't what you don't know gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much, John. That was really just a beautiful lecture. So thank you for that. It was very inspiring. You know, as I was reflecting on your title, from the MR suite to C-suite, you know, at UH we're very proud of our mission to heal, to teach, to discover. And you've been able to do this. You did it in the MR suite as an investigator and as a physician, and now as a leader, you're able to cultivate and help support the tripartite mission, which I think is very inspiring to all of us here, and I'm sure the several hundred individuals that are listening, that listen to your talk, I should say. And I love the corollaries and the ingredients. Very, very practical advice, and I think I speak for the audience when I say, you know, the way you presented, these are lived experiences. It's palpable, and so I really, really appreciate that. And hopefully, I think you're going to find some of our young, aspiring leaders may even reach out to you for guidance after that talk, so thank you. I want to just take a minute. I know the hour is late, and are there any questions from the audience or comments?
I'll make one.
Yeah. Cliff, could I ask you to just come up to the mic, please? Thank you.
I'll make one, and we didn't conspire, Jonathan and I didn't conspire before his lecture, but I think what is clearly evident by virtue of his trajectory and that of many other successful leaders, that ultimately it's not the technical knowledge alone that leads, or the accomplishments alone that leads a person to be successful, as Dr. Lewin has, but it's the embodiment of the key personal traits and the way that he has designed his interactions with his environment, that being his colleagues. And if you follow those guidelines that he has, I think, very nicely listed, and hopefully maybe you could share those at the end with some folks, I think that's the key ingredient, is coupling the technical knowledge and the success, but with the personal, emotional, and environmental intelligence that he bestowed on us. So I just, fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cliff. So we're going to wrap up. I want to let you know, you don't have to carry any of this, but I do want to let you and the audience and Linda know that we have a lovely plaque for you. It reads University Hospitals Inaugural Alumni Healthcare Leadership Lecture, September 30th, 2021, keynote speaker, Jonathan Lewin. And so we will make sure we get that to you safely. I'm very nervous holding it because it is slippery. And then the other is the 150th anniversary book that I think you'll enjoy. And it has a note. I have not read it, but it has a note from Cliff just for you. So with that, again, if you can join me in thanking Dr. Lewin for a wonderful lecture. And so I'm going to wrap up. Again, I want to just thank the speakers and the audience for your engagement. I want to congratulate our trainees. 100 days, and between all the talks you heard today, the history of this institution from Michael DeGiorgio, leaders like Dr. Tomei, and exemplars like Dr. Lewin, I hope you're inspired and you represent the next generation of investigators and leaders for this institution. And then finally, I would be remiss not to end with thanking my colleagues who've put this event together, in particular E. Fritz, Nicole Bollinger from UHRNE, Shelley Parkhurst, who leads our alumni efforts, and Will Rebello, who manages graduate medical education. So with that, thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a wonderful evening. Be well.